technical. I'm being recorded, by the way. My name is Cara Sale, and I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York State, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Today our webinar is Harm Reduction 102, which is a follow-up to our first webinar called Harm Reduction 101 that probably many of you attended. If not, that recording is available. And today we're going to focus with our presenters on a further exploration of the strategies and support that really help to implement those practices that were talked about, with a focus on motivational interviewing and person-centered care. There will be opportunities to ask questions and participate with your presenters as well. But before we get started, I just want to take a quick moment to orient everyone to our WebEx system so you know how to participate. I'm sure most of you do, but just in case, everyone is put on mute so we don't hear any background noises. But you can chat in the chat box. The chat box is over to the right, and you will see a little bubble that you can click on. Sometimes it's on the bottom of your screen, sometimes it's on the right, and you can click that to bring up your chat box. That's the chat box feature, and you can chat in there to myself, to the host, or to the presenters, and we will respond to you, or we will take your questions and get to them as soon as possible. Thanks so much again for joining us. Again, this will be recorded and available to you afterwards. We're very excited and very fortunate to have Jenna Tyne from the Bridge, and she's been in this field for a long time, as has Naomi Weinstein. She's from the Institute of Community Living, and so they're bringing a lot of their own expertise with you, as you may have known from the last webinar if you participated. So today's really just an opportunity to go deeper around a lot of the concepts. Thank you much to both of you. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves quickly and before we get started so that everyone does have a little more information about you. Welcome, everyone.
So I'm Jenna Tyne. I'm currently the Senior Vice President of Outpatient Services at the Bridge, and I have been a harm reductionist for just about 20 years now, since the beginning of my career.
And my name is Naomi Weinstein, and I am the Vice President of Innovations at ICL. And I've not been a harm reductionist for my entire career. I'm a new to harm reduction person. I did spend 15 years in abstinence-driven residential drug treatment. So my perspective on this has been a little harder to come by. So we're going to get started. The agenda for today, just to give everyone a sense of where we're heading, we're just going to very quickly review some of the key points that we made in our first webinar 3 weeks ago. We're going to talk a little bit about building trust, which seems such an easy thing to do, but is really part of the crux of everything in a harm reduction approach. We'll talk about stage-wise approaches and what do we do with folks who are in that kind of classic pre-contemplation, contemplation stage of behavior change. We'll talk a little bit about how some of the tools that we know from motivational interviewing can be used in harm reduction, and then we'll do some Q&A. And we pulled out 4 questions that we did not get a chance to answer last time that we will start off with, and then add on some additional questions that you have given what we've been talking about. So that's where we're headed. So, Jen, you want to start?
Sure. So some of the key points that we went over in Harm Reduction 101, the biggest one is that harm reduction embraces all possible responses to risky behaviors, from abstinence all the way to safer continued use. That is based on the person in front of you and what their goal is. We talked a lot about when people feel that they're being judged, they avoid connecting. A lot of the people that we've worked with have been in multiple institutions. I like to say that they're trans-institutionalized because they go from one institution to another. And they have come into contact with people like us and what they assume to be us for a very long time. So people know themselves best. I say this all the time, that people are the experts in their own lives, and part of harm reduction is believing that and knowing that if you give people the tools to take care of themselves, they will. Safety underlies all harm reduction efforts, and harm reduction strategies can be used throughout the entire process of working with someone, from engagement to treatment planning to service delivery. So we're going to talk a little bit today about working a little bit more in depth from a harm reduction perspective. perspective. So it's very similar to other models. You need to build a trusted relationship. You have to collaboratively determine goals and realistic objectives, right? We all want smart goals and objectives. You provide services, build skills, support safety. You support small incremental change and the development of self-efficacy. And you'll see in red, the biggest difference, I think, in working from a harm reduction perspective is collaboratively identifying the most pressing issues. So what we sometimes think are the most pressing issues are not actually the most pressing issues for our clients. And so having real, open, honest conversations about what in their life feels the most pressing. So we may have people who are actively using and not paying their rent and about to be evicted, and from an objective sort of service provider perspective, the losing the apartment might be the most important thing or the most pressing issue that we see, but that client in front of you might have a different issue. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you get to that point. So when you're building trust, you know, we're going to talk first about how the traditional way goes about asking people immediately about treatment when someone says they're using, sort of jumping right to further assessment and really pushing people to get into treatment. When you first meet with someone, doing lengthy assessments to understand the history of drug use and associated problems, and focusing primarily on the downsides of drug use. So that's a pretty standard, that's kind of what most of us have been trained to do. And from a harm reduction perspective, it's essential that we demonstrate that our priority is their safety.
I'm just thinking about some of those assessments and all the different questions. We have such detailed questions about which drug you use, how old you were when you started using that drug, what quantity of drug that you're using currently, history around recovery, and recovery is code for abstinence.
Yep.
And a whole bunch of assumptions there. And every single statement lets the person know that's not good behavior, that's a problem. It's usually nested in within a whole bunch of other questions about homelessness, school dropout, incarceration history, and our judgment is just kind of seeping out with every additional question and follow-up that we make.
Yep. I think that's a great point, right? Because that's how the system sort of sets us up, because those assessments are required. Yeah. So staff have to ask those questions. And, you know, I think some of the ways I've gotten around that in the past is really making it a conversation, doing the assessment tool really well and having a conversation instead of just going down and checking off boxes has really worked well for me. And it also engages them around, you know, I'll ask them, what has using substances done for you? Because if you can, the positive, how has this helped you? Because most of the time there's a long trauma history that goes along with it. So I'll say, and I've already asked about that. In the first meeting, I've asked them about their sexual trauma, their homelessness, right? So, you know, you're really sort of asking people to put their entire lives out there for you in that first session. So I try to do as much of that conversationally as possible. And if I can't get the answer in the first session, I document that. I'd rather have someone give me honest answers than go for a checklist where they say no, 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 and then I read the referral paperwork and they have a lot of substance history.
And the chances are that people aren't being honest up front about that initially because it's just another stain on who you are. You're coming as a stigmatized person A and you're just like furthering that in.
Correct.
Great.
So trust, showing that we care, right? So asking about safety strategies. When people tell me they use substances, I immediately sort of go into my Rolodex of knowledge in my brain and ask specific questions that I think might come up depending on the substance of choice and their modality of use. I focus on any risk that might result from the drug use, help them develop strategies. I ask clients about their efforts to stay safe on their own because they have them. People who use substances, I think we have this categorization of them as hopeless and not wanting to care for themselves, chaotic users, and it's actually not true. If they're given the right tools and strategies, they will attempt to implement.
Can you just say for a second about what are some examples of ways clients stay safe? Like people might not recognize that you recognize as safety strategies as that.
So using with someone, and if they don't have someone to use with, at least letting someone know that they're using is a huge safety strategy. Trying out their substance first, and so taking what we call like a test or a taste of it, so that they know the potency of it. I ask people, do you know your dealer? Right? The biggest safety strategies for people who use substances is where they purchase their substances and who they purchase from. And I think sometimes just asking them that, they sort of look at me like, oh, no one's ever asked me like to have a relationship with the person who supplies me with my substances. It's extremely important to know your dealer and trust your dealer, particularly in our current climate of opioid use with fentanyl and you know, you want to make sure that you're asking those questions. So just even very, very basic ones like that, that's going away.
I think, you know, it also means it's not just that your credibility goes up and the trust goes up, but people start identifying safety strategies as something that they have the capacity to do and maybe expert in already. And providing those kinds of compliments and identification pieces helps build up self-efficacy, which I know we'll talk about later.
We're going to talk about, yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. Great.
So the risk that people, when you ask them what type of risk, they're really sure. So here's some of the areas that I touch on: health, family relationships. I'll ask them how substance use has impacted their relationships, both for the better and the worse, right? Like I'm not just going to focus on the negatives. Legal risks, economic, which I think we all know, and I think our clients who sort of use substances regularly all have economic problems because of it. Housing, which I know that we're all very aware of, and then just their spiritual sense of self, who they are, system, and sort of the lifestyle of being a substance user, I think sometimes can wear away at your sense of self and that self-efficacy that you're talking about.
Well, it's interesting. I think about some of some drug users who we don't always think about. So I mentioned this in the webinar. We're down in the Wall Street area in Manhattan, and so I know that there are people just 2 or 3 blocks north who are using substances frequently. My guess is most of them will still identify themselves as stockbrokers first and drug users second.
Correct.
But the folks who are coming generally into our systems identify themselves as drug users first and everything else second, and we need to start shifting some of those pieces. There's other reasons.
Excellent. Yes.
So what are some of the questions that you ask a person to elicit their most pressing issues, right?
Yeah, so, you know, some of the questions I'll ask, and I won't always just go straight for how substances might be presenting as risks. I sort of ask them what they feel in the moment is the most stressful thing happening for them, right? Okay. And so just asking a basic question like that, a lot of times people will tell me, you know, my COPD, right? And so even just telling me that the COPD is stressing them out, I'm going to do a little bit of a nicotine assessment. And then I'm going to have a conversation about how, you know, sometimes when people smoke, when they drink or when they smoke marijuana, they tend to smoke more cigarettes, right? Because I'm coming at it from the COPD angle and trying to assess how substances might play out in the COPD.
Right.
Right? Or I'll say, you know, they'll say something about a relationship. They have a significant other and there's lots of fights. Depending on the engagement level I have with them, I'll sort of assess how are substances playing out in this relationship.
Right.
Not because I'm concerned about the substance use, I am concerned about the substance use, not as the main factor, more of like, well, let's figure out what's going on in this relationship, right? It's always sort of the substance use as a secondary thing because it can be very problematic in a lot of these ways, but I'm going to go where they bring me first.
Substance use is the vehicle to get to
their issue is the vehicle to sort of get to the substance use. From their perspective. From their perspective, I'm addressing what they think is most pressing in their lives. I am.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
I really am. So, yeah.
All right. So, So this goes back to kind of some of the things we were talking about before in terms of questions that build up credibility. So why don't you talk through some of these?
Yeah, so like I said, you know, we ask people, do they use alone or do they have a friend or a buddy they work with? And then when you get into when people are sort of more comfortable talking about their actual use, I will ask if they're using intravenous drugs. I will ask about if they're rotating their injecting spot. I will ask about vein care. I will ask if they're drinking enough water, right? Because when you're dehydrated, you can't find a vein. And this is some of the more, I think, for mainstream mental health and substance use, radical ideas to actually talk to someone about how they're injecting. Some of the syringe exchange programs in the city actually have nurses that demonstrate, because inappropriate injecting techniques can actually lead to many, 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 many health issues. We ask about if they've had contact with the criminal justice system, pay for their drugs, right? Lots of people engage in sex work, and so we want to do safer sex assessment around what they're doing.
Yeah.
And if they're able to practice safe sex, right, there's lots, if you look online, there are lots and lots and lots of harm reduction techniques for people who engage in sex work, ensuring that someone knows where you are, that you're wearing shoes that you can get run in. You know, there's lots of stuff that goes along with that piece. Do you have a plan to follow in case of an emergency? Do you share your rig or your equipment, or do you use on your own? I always ask where they obtain syringes and if they use a syringe exchange, and I'm going to make that referral if they don't. And then they test their shot before they actually sort of do a full injection.
So this two things come to my mind. What are questions for you, Jenna? One is, you're clearly extremely knowledgeable. I guess that most people don't think about shoes they can run away in.
Yes.
I think most people don't know the word rig as a synonym for drug-using equipment, right? So what do people do if they're not as knowledgeable?
Well, some I would say that they want to look into it, right? If you're working with substance users, it would be like working with people with mental health issues and not knowing about depression, right? It's sort of the same realm, and we don't really see it that way because our answer to most people who are using is treatment instead of this. So there is definitely a learning curve. It's not easy. I mean, I said this in the first one, doing this work is not easy because you have to remove your own feelings from things. And it's also a whole new arena of strategies and safety measures that you have to learn. So a lot of it is, I've also learned a tremendous amount from my clients. I would say most of what I know is from having real conversations with clients. And I will tell you that your clients want to know. So if they use a word and I don't know what it is, I will ask. Like someone told me about a cue ball. I didn't know what a cue ball was, so I asked. And it's actually Seroquel, which has street value because people use it to come down off of stimulants.
Who knew?
So I had no idea, but I asked.
Now our lingo. Now everybody on this call knows about cue balls. One of the things, at the end of this webinar, we have a couple of websites that may provide you with additional information and resources. So if you do want to take the plunge and get more knowledgeable about some of these strategies and techniques, you can use that as your starting point.
Absolutely.
The other question, that's actually it. That was a question. So the next thing, I'm going to go on.
Self-efficacy is huge in harm reduction and people can change in general. It's really difficult for people to make change if they don't believe they'll be successful. So that's really the crux of helping someone build self-efficacy, is that you need to help them create their narrative from a narrative that they will never succeed to a narrative that they have succeeded already, right? So going back to how we talked about that people are already using safety strategies and already successful in some ways, and we need to point out that narrative to them. This is really sort of the crux of that, because that's what builds self-efficacy, right? When you say to someone, oh, that's really good that you never use alone, they sometimes have never congratulations for anything they've done around drug use, right? And it changes the dynamic, it changes the tone, and I'm starting to build self-efficacy. I'm going to help them see that they've already been doing things that have kept them safe, that have kept them well in some regards, and, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about how you do that.
And I think people can, this concept, it's so familiar to anyone who's ever tried to lose weight or start to exercise or do any other behavior change, because we don't think that we can successfully lose 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 30 pounds, 50 pounds. We're not going to go there. Right? That's one of the reasons why on those shows like, you know, The Biggest Loser or whatever, they've got coaches where they're just cheerleading the entire time. Yeah. Because if your own personal narrative says, not going to happen, are you're not going to go for it.
Yep. Well, and I think weight loss is a great way to think about this, because if you think about people who every year consistently make a New Year's resolution to lose weight, you know, the first year you do it, you're like, yes, I can do that. By the third or fourth year you're doing that, you already have a failure narrative in your head, and so you're already sort of psyching yourself out. It's not going to happen.
Right. I just won't buy the Oreos, but I'm not joining a gym this time because that was too much money the first 3 times.
And I'm not going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
I'm really not going to do it anyway. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. All right.
So harm reduction, again, is a realistic approach that acknowledges many people are not ready to suddenly eliminate certain behaviors from their lives. So we sort of purpose made this generic, but a lot of people, you can't pull away their coping mechanism, which for a lot of the individuals we're talking about is the substance use, without replacing it first. So you have to simultaneously help people build self-efficacy so that they can implement other coping strategies outside of the substances.
Absolutely.
So we're going to do a little refresher. We're going to sort of get into motivational interviewing at this point and stages of change. So I'm sure everyone has seen this, and if not, you should save this slide and print it out. What I like about this version is that it also has tasks related to each stage. A lot of times you just see the stages. So very quickly, pre-contemplation is for people who are not yet considering change, and task is to raise awareness.
And we just got in here. It's raising awareness or raising interest in the ability of making a change, because some people, it's not just denial that's the problem, but it's, okay, so I get high. Okay, and whatever, I don't care.
Exactly. That's a great point. And contemplation is where people are ambivalent, and the task there is to resolve the ambivalence, move towards change. In this area, you'll get a lot of resistance, and so, you know, the motivational interviewing, rolling with resistance. Then you get determination and/or planning, it's also called, which is the stage where you're going to help people identify change strategies, and people have made a commitment to change, but they need the plans to be successful. Action is actually putting those changes you've talked about into place. They haven't yet become routine, and the task here is to actually help make change, prevent relapse, and really, really, really support the person, because this is sort of stage where things can go the most wrong, if you will. Yeah. And then you go to maintenance, where people are developing the skills to maintain change. So lots about maintenance, you know, and this is another webinar in the future, but lots about maintenance is around maintaining that self-efficacy and having self-compassion and resiliency. That is how long-lasting change happens. If you look at most of the research around this is around weight loss, but self-compassion, resiliency, and self-efficacy are the trio of things that help people maintain the change that they've made.
And it just occurs to me, I haven't heard you say that word self-compassion before, but how unbelievably potent and difficult to achieve it is for people who have been struggling with substance use issues for many, many years. Mm-hmm. They've often gotten to that point of having issues around their substance use because of a lack of compassion from others or from themselves. Yep. And self-esteem is just
Yep.
And to build up that sense of forgiveness.
Yes.
And,
incredibly powerful.
Really intense. Mm-hmm. Really, really intense. One of the things that we used to talk about a lot in drug treatment was it takes a lot of time for somebody who's in drug treatment, who has achieved abstinence, to acknowledge how their behavior has in the past impacted others. Because it's so painful, mm-hmm. it can trigger relapse. Mm-hmm. And so how do you get to, in a child welfare population, if you've got a mom who is confronted by her 15-year-old about all the ways she's screwed up parenting, it takes a long time to say you're right.
It does.
I'm sorry.
That's a great point, and I think that the things that protect against that are self-compassion, knowing that you have self-efficacy, right? Because we work with a lot of people who've gotten to maintenance before, right? And so their failure narratives start to crop up again, right, as they start to deal with without having that self-compassion, right? As they start to deal with sort of what in the wake of their substance use.
Right.
So I think that's a really good point. And then I particularly like this model because it has recurrence as part of it, and they don't call it relapse, it's called recurrence. We want to be as positive as possible, and it's a fine line to walk to help people understand that recurrence is part of this. People will relapse at some point. And
although it's not required.
It's not required. There are people who don't relapse. However, you want to sort of, it's a fine line because you don't want to say to people, well, you're just going to relapse through all of this. That's why I call it recurrence. That's why I like this model. And the task here is coping with the consequences and choosing next steps. You're also going to have a very good, I try to work with my clients to help them see recurrence as a learning opportunity. Right? And again, remember we talked about resiliency, self-compassion, and self-efficacy. The higher someone's resiliency, the more likely the recurrence will be shortened period as opposed to a long, drawn-out,
protracted event.
Yeah, relapse, where the relapse lasts for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. Right? We want to try to make sure that those recurrences are time limited and go back to helping people work with their self-efficacy and the skills that they've learned.
Absolutely. All right.
So we're going to spend most of our time on pre-contemplation and contemplation because I think this is sort of the most challenging, and we're going to talk about stage-related assessment. So in pre-contemplation, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this in a minute, but one of the things we use is a readiness ruler, and in pre-contemplation, I like to ask people on a 1 to 10, how serious is their use? And then depending on how they answer, right, some people will say, it's not serious at all, it's a 1. And then I'll say, well, how come it wasn't a 0? Right? You think it was a 1 as opposed to a 0.
Right.
Or someone will say, it's a 5. And I'll say, okay, well, what would need to happen for you to get to a 9 or 10? What would it look like if you were seriously using? And
I'm trying to define the problem.
Trying to define the problem, and I'm also trying to get them, right, because when you ask people to do things on a scale, you sort of help them realize where they truly are on the scale. And so if someone tells me a 5, but they've been incarcerated, they don't have their children, they're about to lose their apartment, I'm going to say, what else? So that's a lot. What's going to get you to a 9 or 10?
Right.
Right? Because I'm pointing out sort of, without being judgmental about drug use, I'm pointing out all the stressors and the things that I see in their lives that are problematic.
Absolutely.
Or I'll say, what would be a warning sign of a real problem, right? Get them to define what a problem is.
People who, they'll admit, they'll say, I'm like a 9 or a 10, and warning signs, I'm there. So there's no denial whatsoever, but still not interested in change.
So if they're not sort of, deny the word denial, but if they're not denying that they are using substances, the person's really in contemplation at that point, right? So even though they're between pre-contemplation and contemplation. So
there are kind of levels within each stage.
There are levels within each stage, for sure. You have people in pre-contemplation that you'll talk to who, I used to work on an ACT team. I would go do home visits. I would see the evidence that there had been a party and there was a crack pipe on the table, and I would say, whoa, what happened here? Oh, nothing, nothing, just nothing. And working with him over and over and over again, I got him to the point where he would say that other people were using in his apartment. It's a tiny incremental change that I'm okay with. You're at least admitting that there's use in your apartment because there's a crack pipe on your table. So we got to have a real, truthful sort of engagement here. So when you get to people who are in contemplation, you're going to start thinking about the ambivalence and developing the discrepancy, right?
Okay.
Because they are using, and they're saying that there's no problems, but on a case-by-case basis, there might actually be problems, right? They might be facing eviction. So you sort of help them to that idea that maybe there is something going on. And honestly, I've done trainings where people say, I have a client, he's paying all his bills, his apartment is fine, he's got a relationship, but he drinks every day. If there's nothing sort of hitting that, then you got to find out what their goal is for even further, right? Because focusing on the substance use is going to get you anywhere.
Well, it's interesting because the way you just put it was ABC problem, ABC success, but he's drinking alcohol every day, as opposed to and. But identifying we got a problem here, and this is going to overwhelm everything else.
Correct. Even if it doesn't, people immediately go to. But drinking. And I'll say, okay, well, is the drinking problematic?
Right.
Sort of stepping back and taking the judgment out of it.
Right, and that's the hardest thing, right?
It is the hardest thing.
So clearly trained between advertising and, movies come out, Beautiful Boy comes out, and all the different things with addiction, and we're reading all about the opioid epidemic. And if anybody tells you, I don't know who, but when it tells me they went to the dentist and I got some Vicodin, I'm like, oh, put that stuff away. You don't want to go near that. I'm already in my judgment head.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we've been socialized to feel that way.
And I do think, ultimately that if you don't start, you're in much better shape.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also not a person who's using it to cope and don't have other coping mechanisms. And so I have to kind of see someone else's, not from mine.
Yep. That's the empathy that sort of comes into it.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. Things that we were talking about, Jenna, before was in terms of contemplation and jumping too fast ahead.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that Naomi and I were talking about is when somebody, when you've got someone in contemplation and you get them to the point where they're like, yeah, maybe this might be a problem, I think we tend to jump right to talking about treatment. But if you remember from the stages of change, there is a lot that goes on in determination and planning to get somebody there. And so we don't want to immediately jump to treatment when we feel like somebody is starting to think about addressing their substance use. The first thing I do when someone says, like, yeah, you know what, I think it might be an issue, is I ask them, so what would you like to do about it? Okay. They are the expert. I'm not going to offer any suggestions unless they ask me for suggestions, right? So if I say that and someone says, I don't know, what are my options? I will literally go through every option from harm reduction all the way to abstinence objectively.
Safer use all the way.
Safer use all the way to abstinence.
Okay. So the question here, would the change in the stages of change for harm reduction to be safe or abstinence or both in a process model?
So great question. I love these questions because I think the best answer is it depends on the client's goal. So the stages of change for harm reduction, what you're working towards is whatever your client has identified. So for some people, that is going to be abstinence. For some people, it might be safer use. I'm very excited when I get somebody from pre-contemplation to contemplation and they're willing to talk to me about safety strategies, because frequently when they're in pre-contemplation, they're saying that they don't use. So can I talk about safety strategies if someone's saying they don't use? But I don't give up. I keep engaging, engaging, and I find out more about them as a person. And the more I engage with them as a person and not as a substance user or someone with a mental health diagnosis, the more lasting the relationship becomes, right?
And to keep in mind, of course, and I think we mentioned this last time, but if we didn't, I'll mention it now, that people are at the same stage of change for each substance that they use. And most of the people that we know don't just use opiates. They're using opiates, just smoking weed, and they're also drinking. Yep. And they may dabble in other things as well, right? So you may be in one stage for one thing and another stage for another thing, and your interest, safer use versus abstinence, it depends on which substance, depends on the risks and the consequences related to each substance. Frequently when I meet with people and we're sort of in the stage process, I will actually show them that circular model and ask them to point out where they think they are in that model, and we date it and we put what stage they're in and the date, because we want to track it, right? We want to track. Sometimes people come to me and they're in planning determination and something horrible happens and they go back to pre-contemplation, and then we pick up right back up at planning, right? And I want people to know their own cycles, because later, if there's a recurrence, I'm going to go back and show them, okay, so remember this time where you stepped back? We went right back to planning. So how did we do that? Right.
Again, building that self-efficacy. How did we go back and do that again? And when people use more than one substance, I will have them identify which stage they're in on that same paper by substance. So someone who main drug choice is alcohol, and for alcohol, they're definitely in planning or determination, but they also use crack, but only when they're drunk. So for them, they would put crack as contemplative
Right.
because they believe that if they stop the drinking, that the crack use might stop as well. I'm going to join them there.
Right.
I don't know enough at that point. We don't have enough of a history together for me to say that's true or not. They're the expert in lives, and so they're demonstrating where they are on that stage of change.
And just to take it a step further, you will never know that.
Never.
So I think going back, your original point was you have to accept that the coach is always the expert in his or her own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that I don't know enough yet, and I'll gather that knowledge. I will never know as much.
I will never know as much.
And I need to be respectful of that knowledge.
Yes.
And also respectful of the fact that some people may not be fully disclosing everything because we haven't earned their trust yet. And it takes a lot on our end to earn their trust that we're not going to betray them.
Yep.
We disclose whatever they're doing. And that's one of the reasons why some of these safety strategy questions are so important, because it demonstrates that rather than judging, condemning, and potentially involving other systems that can be more traumatizing, I want to make sure you're safe.
Yep.
What do we do to work on that?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. All right. Next.
Yeah, we have to be patient. Change doesn't come easy for any of us. For anybody who's ever tried to change a behavior, we all know that it can be very challenging. You brought up the New Year's resolution and losing weight. I think more than half of America does that.
Yes, and that's why the gyms all advertise in December, right? We're all going to see, Javelin or whatever they are, starting January 1 with all those ads. Trust in the relapse process.
Yep. Again, just to point out, right, so a lot of our clients have tried to change multiple times in the past and have failed at it. So you have to be mindful that people have these narratives in their minds that they can't do this. And in true sort of from a mental health perspective, you have to lend them your ego. You have to believe that they can make this change.
And you can't do that by making these vague cheerleading statements. You can do it. You're great. That's not going to be enough.
No.
Right? It's got to be specific to things that they already accomplished.
Right.
Which is, you say you can't, and yet I see you're so interested in keeping yourself safe that you have never used by yourself. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Most people can't say that. I'm so impressed with that skill that you have.
Yes.
And so that is being specific about capacity and competency.
And we're going to talk a little bit about more of that when we get to the affirmations, because I think that's huge too. Yeah.
Great.
So I like this quote. This is a quote from James Prochaska, and he says, consciousness raising is a process in which the individual needs to increase his or her awareness about the negative consequences, the causes, and the cures of the problem behavior. So it's really the crux of sort of stage change and motivational interviewing, right? Helping people raise consciousness. And it's true for everything we've talked about, from pointing out the safety techniques that they're already using to helping them develop some discrepancies between what's actually happening and what their goal is, right? Rolling with resistance, all sort of piles into this one quote. It's about awareness, and we're going to talk about how you help people get to awareness now.
Great. This is both, again, pre-contemplation and contemplation. All right.
So, like what we said, one of the most effective techniques in the harm reduction context is motivational interviewing. We're going to, and if you have not had a motivational interviewing training course, I highly, highly recommend it. Motivational.
And if you have, take more.
Yes.
It is so hard to do this right.
Yes.
And when you can successfully use these approaches, there's so much benefit, but it's really tricky. And I've seen too often people get well trained and then they don't do it.
Yeah. I mean, this is like a semester-long course that someone could take, right? Motivational interviewing, these are just a few of the main points, right? It elicits the person's own internal desire to make changes. It builds self-efficacy, and we're going to talk about affirmations. You will be getting into battles about change. The pace is set by the person. The pace is not set by the staff person.
Sorry.
It's okay.
We'll edit that for the final version.
and emphasizes a need for change and a hope that change can occur. So that's what I was just talking about. Like, in the moments where your client just feels very hopeless because they're replaying their failure narrative in their head, you are the hope. You are the constant that knows that they can make these changes. Again, just a couple of core principles. So on the left, you'll see expressing empathy, developing discrepancy, rolling with resistance, and supporting self-efficacy. We've talked about just about all of that. And then ORS, which is open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summarizing statements. And I know that we're going through this very quickly, but motivational interviewing is a training in and of itself, and we're going to talk a little bit about how you use it with the clients.
Oops.
So this ruler, we talked a little bit about this in the context of their use and where they saw themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. You're talking about the readiness ruler in motivational interviewing. You're assessing someone's readiness for change on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And you ask somebody, do you have behavior that you'd like to change, Naomi?
Candy fan. I eat less sweets, fewer sweets.
Okay. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is that you're not ready at all, and 10 is you're completely ready, where do you think you fall?
This is my readiness to change. This is my readiness to admit that I've got an issue.
Well, you just admitted to me that you have an issue, that you'd like to eat fewer sweets,
yeah.
right? So you recognize that there's something.
Okay.
And so here, in terms of if I asked you to change tomorrow, how ready would you feel to change?
3.
Okay, great.
Give me a week.
Yeah. So 3 is actually really good, right? Because you could have been at a 0, a 1, or a 2. So there is there's some motivation to change. What would it take for me to get you, or for you to get to a 5 or a 6?
I would jump on it if there was a bad A1C. I would think it more if I started tracking the amount of sweets that I eat.
Yes.
Yeah, let's just go with those.
Okay, those are both wonderful. So, would you be willing to track your sweets for the next week?
You can't see my face, people who are listening. It's a little shock and horror. Maybe, yeah. Okay. So, because tracking your sweets is going to give us a good idea of the scope of happening. Do I have to show it to you?
You have to show it to me, but I'm going to have you look at it because I think when we write things down, we're either shocked that we're not eating as many as we think, or we're eating far more than we think. So why don't we start there? Okay. And then we'll come back together next week.
When we come back in November, doing this.
So that's a little bit of how you would do a readiness ruler. I mean, it's sort of to do without a real case, but having those conversations about how do you move people up and down the readiness ruler.
Okay. All right.
Affirmations. We've been talking a lot about affirmations, right? So affirmations, like you said, they have to be specific. You have to know what you are praising someone for. And harm reduction, this is what I love about harm reduction. It is small, tiny, incremental change. I worked with homeless LGBT youth for many, many years, and they would come in and tell me about their substance use, and we would talk about change strategies. And a lot of those change strategies sometimes were around, instead of starting to use at noon, they would hold off till 5 p.m. because they needed to go to the Medicaid office and apply for this housing program and stop at this therapist's office. And they would come in and tell me that they were successful all week, not using before 5 p.m. I would throw like a mini party, and they would look at me like I was just totally off my rocker. But it was a specific thing, and it started to build their self-efficacy, because if they can wait till 5 o'clock, maybe they can wait till 7 o'clock. Maybe they can wait till 8 o'clock. Maybe I can say at one point, well, how about we try to use on Monday? Right. Building that self-efficacy and really throwing a party over something someone else would say, well, they're still using. Right. Yeah, they are still using, but they're building their self-efficacy by demonstrating control over it.
Right. It's interesting that we're not hitting bottom. We're at a completely different route to get to a healthier way of living, safer way of living.
Yeah. Because harm reduction really wants to try to reduce all the harm related to substance use, and a lot of that is also trauma. And when you allow people to hit rock bottom, you're allowing trauma to build on top of trauma. Yeah, so we want to address that trauma, and because that trauma that builds on top of trauma prevents them from being successful with this.
Yeah.
So we don't want to allow people to continue to have those experiences.
Right.
Recognizing that what you think is easy may take tremendous effort for the people that you're working with, and then affirm the effort, commitment, belief, or skills over and over again. If you give someone a skill and they agree they're going to try it, and they do it 15 times and they're only successful once, I only talk about the one successful time, right? I'm going to say, what was different about that one time where it worked?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sort of addressing the times that it didn't work, but I'm addressing it through the positive.
Got it.
Okay. Just the balances. So I hope everyone has seen these before. The only thing I'm going to say about this, right, is a lot of people, when they sit down and do the decisional balance, they do the pros and cons of making a change, and they forget to do the pros and cons of staying as is. There are definitely pros for individuals to maintain the behavior that they're doing, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. And so you want to make sure, and a lot of times I'll say to people, so what's a positive about not making change? What's a positive about continuing to use? And the immediate response is, there are no positives. And I say, well, that doesn't really make sense, because human beings engage in behaviors that have value, right? So I'm telling you that I know that there's some value to it. So let's have a real conversation about what the value is.
Right.
I feel less stressed in the moment. It keeps me connected to friends. There's a whole host of reasons why there are pros to staying as is. So one little piece about the decision balance, don't forget to do the staying as is pros and cons.
It makes it different from a regular pro and con list.
Correct.
All right.
So a lot of times we're just going to touch on people who are mandated to treatment, because I get a lot of questions about how to do this with people who are mandated. So, or mandated, that you like to say.
Mom-dated is a phrase we used to use in drug treatment for people who are mandated to treatment by their families, saying you go into treatment or you don't. You go find yourself another place to be. So we call it mom-dated.
So just because a person is mandated to treatment doesn't mean they're in action phase. I think we all know this. And you still can work with people in pre-consultation. I think the thing that I like to address when someone's mandated is that, if their goal is that they no longer want to be mandated, then we're going to talk about all the things that need to happen for them not to be mandated. That's been my goal too. And frequently that means coming to session, that means engaging in program. A lot of times it means stop substance use, right? So you're going to do motivational interviewing around that goal and help them see that if they continue to smoke marijuana and come up with positive UTOXs, they will reach their goal of not being mandated, right? It's not a different technique. You're coming at it from a different sort of viewpoint because they are mandated. And I love when people say, well, people who are mandated don't want to do anything. If they walk through your door, they're demonstrating that they want to do something.
Absolutely.
Even if they're only demonstrating that they want to be sort of compliant with this mandation, demonstrating something, and you want to positively affirm for them and build their self-efficacy just from showing up.
But I think also there's another piece to this, which there's a question that came in about housing, as I want to get to, but I think kind of weaves in, which is, by doing all of this, you are not negating or overstepping real consequences, right? In a housing program that doesn't allow substance use on site, people to make the decisions based on their understanding of real consequences. Mm-hmm. That might mean in child care. I know there was a question last time that we didn't get to about families involved in social services and what happens when a family where a child, for example, has been taken and placed into foster care, and the judge is mandating a series of quote-unquote clean friends for a certain amount of time to demonstrate abstinence as a proxy or a proxy indicator that a child will be safe. Don't tell a parent, you don't you ignore that very real consequence for the person who's using, right? In the same with the housing, you don't say, well, it doesn't matter if you're or not, we'll just help you get away with it. People are making decisions based on their understanding of all the consequences. It's their decision to make, even if you don't agree with their decision, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, too, because I think we're faced with this a lot, right? We have people in housing where we know that the housing mandates that they are abstinent. We know they're using. They're telling us they're using. I'm still going to be motivational interviewing, right? So I'm going to say, is your goal to keep using or is your goal to maintain housing? Because the discrepancy, those two things can't go together. And so if they say to me, I'd like to maintain my housing, then I'm going to say, okay, so we know that we use in the housing, so what options do you have? And sometimes people do have other options and sometimes they don't. I know I have clients who prefer to use on the street, so because they know that they can't use in housing. So the conversations we have are around how do you safely do that? Because I've sort of said, I think the best thing would be that you're sort of reducing your use overall. But if you're not ready to do that, what kind of conversation do we have about that? Right? Saying you should use in your apartment, I don't think they should use in their apartment. I also don't think they should use outside, but again, I'm treating them like an adult who make their own decisions. And I think what you're saying about consequences is absolutely right. I will tell them, right? So your consequence is that you could be evicted from your housing, and the second consequence is that you could end up in Rikers. Right. So how do we reduce harm around both of this? All while helping them to see that the way to reduce the harm significantly around both of those things is to move towards reduced use or abstinence.
Right.
But they have to get there on their own.
Absolutely. So we're getting very short on time. I actually suggest that before we get to these questions, there are two other questions that have come in the interim that I want to make sure to get to people who are listening right now. Okay. So one of the questions was about people who are in recurrence or relapse and are denying that it's a problem, in part to protect themselves and the very strong emotions that have around that recurrence of symptoms.
So saying that they've denied that they had a recurrence. So I think, again, what I tend to do, right, so they're back in pre-contemplation. If you know that there's been a recurrence and they're denying there's been a recurrence, I'm going to go back to my pre-contemplative sort of approaches and try to move them through to contemplation, right? So obviously, if there's a recurrence that you know about, something has happened. And so I talk about the event that happened and try to tease out, what happened, where did this go wrong? And if they continue to say that they're not using substances, I just stay in pre-contemplation with them. I roll with that resistance. If they have had a recurrence and they're not dealing with it appropriately, chances are you are going to have another opportunity rather than later to talk about it, because there will likely be another event. And if there's not another event, then there's not really anything to address in that moment.
Right. All right. Two great questions. One is the success of using harm reduction approaches with people who have mental illness.
I work in mental health. I started out in the harm reduction substance use field, but moved to mental health very quickly in my career. And I think it is tremendously important for people with substance use and mental health disorders to be from a harm reduction perspective. People who have psychiatric diagnoses need the same level of efficacy building. They need the same risk reduction strategies. Sometimes they need the risk reduction strategies even more because in my experience, my people that I work with who have mental health diagnoses are also sort of for people who are either selling drugs or doing drugs, right? Absolutely. Like we've all had the client who allows 10 people to move into their apartment because, I had one where he let 10 people move in and the dealer who moved in was using his apartment to cook his crack on the stove. And my client got free crack for the whole time he was allowed to stay there, right? So that was a tremendous sort of lift for motivational interviewing because the client was, because of youth, he was also very symptomatic. And I will tell you, it took a very long time to sort of address all of those issues and help him get back to a point where he recognized that what he was doing was very, very risky.
Mm-hmm. Another question, and I think this actually has two pieces, my answer has two pieces to it. What are some of the challenges of using harm reduction approaches? And there's another question about suggesting the best way to introduce harm reduction to community leaders. There's another question that also feeds in here, I think, about report client progress using a harm reduction approach for people who are mandated and abstinence is required. And I think, I'm going to let Jenna answer this in a second, and probably the last question we'll get to today, but my answer would be most people aren't on board with this. And so the real challenges is how do you use approaches in a way that's acceptable to your supervisors and to your program leadership and to the community and to the judge and to the agency. I think it's actually easier to work with individuals at this level, but less on the macro system level.
Yeah. So, I think it's such a parallel process in some ways, right? Because, all of the people that are on this right now are already using a lot of these strategies. If a client comes to you and discloses that they're in a very risky situation, most people address the risk, right? They may not address it from this philosophy, but they know they have to address the risk.
Can you give me an example?
So, staff who are not harm reductionists, but a client will come to them and say, I'm going to be evicted, and I got the eviction notice, and it has to do with X, Y, and Z, whatever the X, Y, and Z are. My staff aren't going to say, oh, well, you're here for therapy today, so let's not address the eviction, right? They're going to address the eviction immediately. Absolutely. Because we all want our clients to be safe and, right? So all of what's happening, we're already doing, it's sort of building staff self-efficacy to take it a step further and sort of think about it in this framework. I think that there's lots of benefit. I think it actually is a much easier sell when you talk about it impacts the people you're working with. So I like the question about if someone's mandated and their goal is abstinence, how do you report client progress with this approach? So when someone's mandated to me, right, their goal is to, and they tell me that their goal is to complete this mandated treatment, I'm going to say, well, part of that is abstinence. And so let's talk about abstinence strategies. And if people relapse, I'm going to still write that we talked about abstinence strategies and, they relapse because of X, Y, and Z. And we talked about sort of how to have those recurrences safely, but also talked about the importance of abstinence, right? So in some ways, when you can't do pure harm reduction when someone's mandated because you do have to continue to be talking about the abstinence, but talking about the abstinence does not negate that you can still do the safety strategies, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's 1 o'clock right now. We have on the screen here some sources that you might find helpful, and when this gets posted in a week or two, you can get this full time, but basically the Harm Reduction Coalition has some great resources. Here to Help, which is a project of the British Columbia Partners for Mental Health and Addictions Information, is another great resource, and Washington Heights Corner Project. Each of these have lots of brochures that for yourself or for your waiting areas, think of the impact that having some of these kinds of materials might mean for people coming in and feeling like they can trust you. Just want to say that. Upcoming events on November, new date, have a date. On November 20th at noon, we're going to have a third part of the harm reduction series, which basically 100% Q&A. Ask us whatever questions you want, and we will just answer. There will not be any presentation. We'll probably have a slide or two that says we've already talked about A, B, C, D, E. Come with your questions. Very specific, very general, your choice. And my last thing is to say thank you to everybody for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, contact ctac.info@nyu.edu. When you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd appreciate it if you would complete that and provide feedback. And as mentioned, we will have our Harm Reduction Live Q&A on November 20th at noon. On behalf of CTAC and Jenna and I, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.